it's important for all of us to realize that there are three principal questions that always come up whenever I'm talking about the Latin Mass or asked about the Latin Mass. And perhaps the first is the silence. I know I was raised in the new Mass, I was ordained in the new Mass, and when I first went to the old Mass as a 24-year-old, I was very taken aback. My mom dragged me, and I wasn't against going, but I was very taken aback at the silence. I didn't like it, I didn't understand it. It seemed to me very awkward. And I think all of us have to realize that in our busy world, we need that silence. The silence is at the heart of the Mass. It is the presence of God. And I remember my abbot, in the year that I was in the monastery in Disentis in Switzerland, he used to always tell us that we had to be silent to hear God. And so the Mass is somewhere where we need that silence. And unfortunately, in a lot of Masses today, there is no silence. It goes from one speaking part to another. And that can become very disruptive to the soul. Remember, Moses fell silent in the presence of God. Elijah recognized God in the silence of the whisper of the wind and the silent breeze. And we must remember that as human beings, our hearts are easily distracted. And the only way we can focus is to have periods of silence. And that includes outside of Mass. We need to have periods of contemplation. If you're constantly going from one activity to the next, even in your life, you're running from something. We have to be able to face who we are, face our sinfulness, and ask God's pardon and His mercy, because we don't want to face His justice. The second big aspect that I always hear time and again is the aspect of the priest facing God. Now, almost everybody says, well, why do you turn your back to the people? Well, that's really beside the point. You don't tell the person in front of you they have their back to you. You realize that you're all facing one direction. And for the ancient church, it was very important to face east. Now, we don't have an eastward-oriented church. Prior to 1900, almost every Catholic church was built facing east. We've gotten away from that tradition. But nonetheless, the early church saw it as facing east because that is the direction from which Christ will come in the second coming. So in the early church, in the catacombs, they would, and when I was in the catacombs this October, I had a little talk with the priest, and he didn't really seem to want to talk about it. But as I noticed, almost every one of the altars that I saw, well, actually every one of the altars I saw, was built into the altar and facing east. He made the comment that there were some freestanding altars in the catacombs, but I asked him if I could see one, because I had never heard of that. Because, again, they would carve the altar out of the east wall, place a crucifix on the east wall. That way they were facing east in the catacombs. When the church came into the public realm, into churches, physical churches, in the 4th century, there were churches like St. Peter's that were built with the doors facing east. Now, when the church was small, the tradition was the priest would be at the altar and the laymen would be on the sides of the altar. But they would all be facing east. Now, later, when the church grew and the people went into the nave, which began to represent the earth, and the priest or the pope stayed in the sanctuary, which represented heaven, the people, yes, they would face the pope for the first part of the Mass. But during the canon, something interesting happened. The deacon would cry out, "Ad orientem," and everybody would turn their backs to the priest, to the pope, because they wanted to be facing east. Everybody was facing east during the Holy Sacrifice. This is something that the liturgists, the modern liturgists, have forgotten or kind of swept under the table, because in fact, even with a new Mass, if you read the rubrics, in today's current sacramentary, it tells the priest to turn and face the people 5 times. Now, how does he turn and face the people if he's already facing the people? It's something that Benedict has been really harping on lately, and hopefully we will get a better clarification of this. We'll begin to understand how Bugnini and many other people at the council really were instrumental in getting the priest to turn and face the people. And Pope Benedict is very poignant about this point in that he says that when the priest faces the people, the circle is closed. A very unfortunate aspect. That when the priest is facing God, facing east, with the people, that the circle is opened to eternity and to all other Christians, namely the Catholic Christians who are in union with the Church. So it is a much more correct theological point, is much more in line with the early Church. And if you've ever noticed Da Vinci's painting of the Last Supper, they're all sitting on the same side of the table. It's not a closed circle. In fact, many liturgists argue, ancient liturgists argue that, like Father Aidan, that Christ would not have been in the center. He would have been on the extreme right. And that's why only one apostle was sitting next to him, St. John. And that's why everybody was asking St. John to ask him of who betrayed him. So he would have been sitting at the extreme right, St. John would have been on his right, and all the other apostles would have flowed around the table in kind of a semi-U circle facing east, the Last Supper. So silence facing east, and the third one is, Father, why do we have Latin?